The judge believed humiliating her would take less than 5 minutes. The kind of quick courtroom lesson that left spectators amused and the defendant embarrassed. But the quiet woman standing alone at the defense table had already noticed 3 legal errors before the hearing had even begun. The morning light filtered through the tall courthouse windows in downtown Boston, reflecting off polished wood benches and the brass rail that separated the public gallery from the courtroom floor. And as people settled into their seats, whispers drifted through the room about the unusual sight unfolding before them. Emily Carter stood quietly beside a small stack of neatly organized folders, wearing a simple gray cardigan and holding a worn leather notebook that looked more suited for a library desk than a courtroom battle. At 38 years old, she carried herself with calm restraint, the kind that often went unnoticed in rooms filled with louder personalities. Across from her, Attorney Daniel Reeves adjusted the cuff of his tailored navy suit. His expression relaxed with the confidence of someone who had argued dozens of cases in front of the same judge. He leaned slightly toward his client, speaking in a low voice, clearly convinced the case would end quickly once the hearing began. At the bench sat Judge Harold Whitman, a man whose reputation for impatience was almost as well known as his decades of legal experience. And as he scanned the docket in front of him, his eyes paused when he noticed that Emily Carter stood without legal representation. A faint smirk crossed his face, the kind that signaled to seasoned lawyers exactly how the next few minutes might unfold. The courtroom clerk finished arranging the files and stepped aside as the judge adjusted his glasses and looked down at the woman standing alone. "Miss Carter," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet room, "I understand you've chosen to represent yourself today." A few people in the gallery shifted in their seats, and Daniel Reeves allowed himself the smallest smile as he glanced toward the spectators behind him. Emily simply nodded once, her posture steady, her eyes attentive. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair. "You do understand this is a complex civil case involving contractual interpretation and state precedent, correct?" he added, the tone polite, but unmistakably condescending. A soft ripple of murmurs moved through the gallery. Representing oneself in a matter like this was rare, and many in the room had already decided the outcome in their minds. Daniel Reeves straightened and cleared his throat with practiced ease. "Your Honor," he said confidently, "we're prepared to proceed whenever the court is ready." Judge Whitman nodded and looked once more at Emily Carter, as if giving her a final chance to reconsider. But she didn't look nervous. She didn't shuffle her papers or glance around for reassurance. Instead, she calmly opened her notebook and flipped to a page she had marked earlier that morning. The movement was small, almost unremarkable, yet something about the quiet certainty in her posture caused one court reporter near the front row to pause before typing the next line. The judge noticed it too, though he quickly dismissed the thought. From where he sat, this hearing would be routine. A brief argument, a predictable ruling, and the woman standing alone at the defense table would leave the courtroom having learned an uncomfortable lesson about how the legal system worked. What he did not realize was that Emily Carter had already read every filing in the case twice, memorized the relevant statutes the night before, and quietly identified the procedural mistake that would change everything before the hearing was over. The courtroom settled into a heavy silence as Judge Harold Whitman lifted the first document from the case file and adjusted it beneath the soft glow of the overhead lamps, the quiet rustle of paper echoing through the room as everyone leaned forward slightly, anticipating what most believed would be a routine dismissal of the woman standing alone before the bench. Attorney Daniel Reeves stepped forward with the smooth confidence of someone who had practiced this moment many times before, placing his hands lightly on the wooden podium as he addressed the court. "Your Honor, this matter concerns a contractual dispute regarding a property management agreement that Ms. Carter failed to fulfill according to the terms clearly stated in the signed contract." His voice carried easily through the chamber, steady and measured, and as he spoke he occasionally glanced toward Emily with an expression that hovered somewhere between polite patience and quiet amusement. "The plaintiff is simply requesting enforcement of the agreement and compensation for the resulting financial loss," he continued, gesturing toward a neatly organized binder of exhibits that sat open beside him. Several people in the gallery nodded subtly, already convinced that the outcome was inevitable. Judge Whitman listened with mild interest, occasionally tapping a pen against the edge of his legal pad while Reeves summarized the timeline of events in careful detail. According to the attorney, the agreement had been straightforward. Emily Carter had signed a consulting contract related to a community redevelopment project, yet months later the plaintiff claimed that she had failed to meet certain obligations outlined in the document. It sounded simple enough, the kind of disagreement that rarely produced surprises in court. When Reeves finished outlining his argument, he turned slightly toward Emily and offered a courteous but unmistakably patronizing smile before returning his attention to the judge. "Unless Ms. Carter has retained legal counsel this morning," he added, "the plaintiff would respectfully request a summary judgment based on the documentation already submitted." A faint murmur passed through the spectators again. The suggestion was clear. Without a lawyer, Emily Carter would not be able to challenge the legal framework Reeves had just described. Judge Whitman folded his hands and glanced down toward her once more. "Ms. Carter," he said, "you may respond." For a moment the room seemed to hold its breath. Emily closed the folder in front of her and stepped forward at an unhurried pace, the soft sound of her shoes against the polished courtroom floor drawing more attention than any dramatic gesture could have. When she reached the podium, she placed her notebook beside the microphone and looked directly at the judge, her expression calm, almost thoughtful. "Your Honor," she said quietly, "before I respond to the plaintiff's argument, I would like to clarify one point regarding the contract that has been referenced." Daniel Reeves tilted his head slightly, curious but still confident. Judge Whitman nodded for her to continue. Emily opened her folder and slid a copy of the agreement onto the podium where the court clerk could see it. "The document being discussed," she said carefully, "was filed as Exhibit A. However, the version submitted to the court is not the final executed agreement." The courtroom reporter paused mid-keystroke. Reeves blinked once, then quickly recovered. "Your Honor," he said with a light laugh, "the document on file is the exact copy signed by both parties." Emily did not react to the interruption. Instead, she turned another page in her notebook and spoke. With the same steady tone. "Actually, the version filed omits the amendment dated March 15th, which modifies the clause the plaintiff just referenced." The air in the courtroom shifted almost imperceptibly. Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly, glancing toward the exhibit folder again. Reeves' confident posture stiffened for the first time that morning. And somewhere in the quiet rows of the gallery, the first hint of curiosity replaced the earlier certainty that this case would end quickly. For a moment no one in the courtroom moved, the quiet stretching longer than expected as Judge Harold Whitman lowered his pen and looked more closely at the document Emily Carter had referenced, his earlier confidence fading slightly as he flipped through the exhibit folder in front of him. The rustle of papers echoed across the polished wood surfaces while attorney Daniel Reeves shifted his weight beside the plaintiff's table, clearly trying to maintain the composed posture that had seemed effortless only minutes earlier. "Your Honor," Reeves said carefully, forcing a polite smile as he stepped forward again, "the plaintiff has submitted the fully executed agreement to the court record." His tone remained controlled, but a hint of irritation crept into his voice. Emily did not interrupt. She simply waited, her hands resting calmly on the podium as the judge continued turning pages. After a few seconds, Judge Whitman glanced up again. "Ms. Carter," he said, adjusting his glasses, "you mentioned an amendment dated March 15th. Are you claiming that amendment changes the clause referenced by the plaintiff?" Emily nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor. The amendment modifies Section 4 of the agreement, which is the clause Mr. Reeves just relied upon in his argument." A faint ripple of whispers passed through the gallery again, the earlier amusement now replaced with cautious curiosity. Reeves opened his binder quickly and flipped through the documents with increasing speed, the confident rhythm of his movements beginning to falter. "Your Honor," he said, clearing his throat, "the amendment referenced by Ms. Carter was never formally submitted as part of the contract package." Emily finally lifted another document from her folder. The paper was crisp but clearly marked with signatures and a notary's stamp. "It was signed by both parties and notarized the same afternoon," she explained calmly. "And according to Massachusetts contract law, any executed amendment attached to the original agreement becomes part of the binding document." The courtroom. Reporter resumed typing quickly, capturing every word. Judge Whitman leaned forward slightly, and gestured for the clerk to take the paper Emily held. As the clerk carried it toward the bench, Daniel Reeves watched with a tightening expression that was impossible to hide now. The judge examined the page for several long seconds. The notary seal was clear. The signatures matched the names on the original contract, and the paragraph in the center of the page directly addressed the clause Reeves had used as the foundation of his argument. Judge Whitman looked up slowly. "Mr. Reeves," he said, "this amendment appears to alter the obligation your client claims was violated." Reeves hesitated for the first time since the hearing began. "Your Honor, I was not aware that such a document had been executed." Emily remained perfectly composed, her voice steady when she spoke again. "It was submitted during the discovery phase 3 months ago," she said quietly. Page 42 of the supplemental filing. A murmur moved through the courtroom again, louder now. Reeves opened the thick case binder and began flipping through the pages more urgently, scanning the numbers in the corner as his earlier certainty slipped further away. In the gallery, several spectators leaned forward, sensing that the hearing they had expected to end quickly was beginning to unfold very differently. At the bench, Judge Whitman studied Emily Carter with a new expression, one that no longer carried the faint amusement from earlier that morning. The quiet woman in the gray cardigan was no longer simply a defendant representing herself. She was someone who had just corrected a professional attorney using precise legal references without raising her voice even once. And for the first time since the hearing began, the balance of the room had shifted. The air in the courtroom felt noticeably different now, the earlier confidence that had filled the room replaced by a quiet tension as Judge Harold Whitman continued examining the amendment document resting on his desk. The judge's fingers traced the paragraph in the center of the page once more before he leaned back slightly in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than dismissive. Across the room, Daniel Reeves finally located the supplemental filing inside his thick binder and paused when he reached page 42, his eyes moving across the text with growing realization. The confidence that had carried him through the beginning of the hearing no longer appeared effortless. He cleared his throat and straightened his posture. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "even if the amendment modifies Section 4, the plaintiff still maintains that Ms. Carter failed to provide the consulting deliverables outlined in the original timeline." His tone was controlled again, though less certain than before. Judge Whitman shifted his gaze toward Emily Carter. "Ms. Carter, you may respond." Emily remained calm as she stepped slightly closer to the podium, her notebook still open to the page she had prepared earlier that morning. She did not raise her voice or rush her words. Instead, she spoke with the same measured clarity that had already begun to change the atmosphere in the room. "Your Honor, the amendment does more than modify the clause referenced earlier," she explained. "It also changes the delivery schedule that the plaintiff is claiming I violated." Another quiet ripple passed through the gallery. Emily turned one page in her notebook and continued. "The original agreement required the consulting report within 90 days. However, the amendment signed on March 15 extends the timeline to 180 days because the scope of the redevelopment project was expanded by the plaintiff." Daniel Reeves frowned slightly and glanced back at the amendment again. Emily reached into her folder and removed another document. "The revised schedule is referenced in the amendment and confirmed by the email correspondence submitted during discovery," she said. "Specifically, the message dated March 16 from the plaintiff's office acknowledging the extended timeline." The clerk accepted the document and carried it to the bench. Judge Whitman studied the page quietly for several seconds. The message was printed clearly with timestamps and the sender's name visible beneath the text. The judge lifted his eyes again toward the plaintiff's table. "Mr. Reeves, this email appears to acknowledge the revised schedule Ms. Carter just described." Reeves adjusted his tie and spoke more cautiously now. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's position is that the extension did not apply to the full scope of the deliverables." Emily waited until the judge looked back toward her before speaking again. "Your Honor, if the court reviews the final paragraph of the amendment, it states that the revised timeline applies to all consulting deliverables associated with the expanded redevelopment proposal." The courtroom had grown completely quiet again. Even the faint whispering from earlier had disappeared. Judge Whitman turned the page of the amendment slowly and read the paragraph Emily had referenced. When he finished, he set the document down and folded his hands together. For the first time since the hearing began, his attention remained on Emily Carter for several seconds. The woman who had entered the courtroom wearing a simple gray cardigan and carrying a worn notebook was now methodically guiding the legal discussion with precise references and carefully organized evidence. In the gallery, several spectators exchanged glances. The case they expected to watch unfold in a predictable direction had taken a very different turn. And at the plaintiff's table, Daniel Reeves closed his binder more slowly than before, aware that the hearing was no longer following the script he had prepared. The quiet tension in the courtroom deepened as Judge Harold Whitman rested his hands on the bench and studied the documents that now lay in front of him. The amendment and the email correspondence forming a trail of details that had not been visible only minutes earlier. The polished wooden room that had once carried faint whispers of amusement now felt careful and attentive, as if everyone present had realized that the hearing was no longer a simple matter of a confident attorney presenting a routine claim. Daniel Reeves remained standing beside the plaintiff's table, though the relaxed posture he carried at the start of the hearing had shifted into something more measured. He opened his binder again and scanned the documents with deliberate focus before addressing the court. "Your Honor," he said steadily. Even with the revised timeline, the plaintiff maintains that the consulting report Ms. Carter was responsible for was incomplete at the time it was delivered. Judge Whitman glanced toward Emily Carter again. "Ms. Carter, would you like to respond to that point?" Emily stepped forward calmly, her gray cardigan catching a faint beam of light from the tall windows behind the bench. She did not look defensive. Instead, she turned another page in her notebook and spoke with the same composed tone that had already reshaped the discussion in the courtroom. "Yes, Your Honor," she said. The report referenced by the plaintiff was delivered in phases as outlined in the revised consulting schedule. A few people in the gallery leaned forward again, following the exchange closely. Emily continued. The amendment expanded the project scope to include an additional environmental impact review, which required coordination with the city planning office. Because of that change, the consulting work was divided into 3 deliverable stages rather than a single final report. Daniel Reeves frowned slightly and flipped through his binder once more. "Your Honor," he said carefully, "the plaintiff's position is that no final report was submitted by the extended deadline." Emily waited until he finished speaking before answering. "Your Honor, the final report was delivered electronically on June 27 at 9:22 in the morning." She paused only briefly before adding another detail. The confirmation receipt from the project coordinator was included in the discovery materials. The courtroom clerk accepted another printed page from Emily and carried it to the judge's desk. Judge Whitman read the document slowly, his eyes moving across the timestamp and the acknowledgement line from the coordinator who had received the file. The room had become so quiet that the faint tapping of the court reporter's keyboard sounded unusually loud. Daniel Reeves leaned slightly toward the plaintiff seated beside him, exchanging a quick whisper before straightening again. The judge set the page down and looked toward him. "Mr. Reeves, the receipt confirms delivery of the final report on the date Ms. Carter just mentioned." Reeves cleared his throat once more. "Your Honor, the plaintiff believed the document submitted was a preliminary version." Emily spoke again before the judge could respond. "Your Honor, if the court reviews the email confirmation on the second page, the coordinator specifically refers to the file as the final environmental and redevelopment assessment." Judge Whitman turned the page and read the line she had referenced. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he leaned back slightly in his chair and looked across the courtroom toward Emily Carter with a noticeably different expression than he had shown at the start of the hearing. The woman who had entered the courtroom alone with a notebook and a quiet voice was now methodically presenting evidence that aligned precisely with the legal framework of the case. In the gallery, the spectators who had once expected a brief and predictable hearing now watched with growing fascination as each careful detail shifted the direction of the argument. And standing at the plaintiff's table, Daniel Reeves slowly closed the binder in front of him, realizing that the case he believed was settled had become something far more complicated. 4. Several long seconds after the final document was placed on the bench, the courtroom remained completely still, the kind of silence that settles when every person present understands that something important has just shifted. Judge Harold Whitman reviewed the email confirmation again, his eyes moving carefully across the lines that Emily Carter had referenced only moments earlier. The timestamp, the subject line, and the acknowledgement from the project coordinator all aligned precisely with her explanation. Slowly, the judge placed the page down beside the other documents and looked across the room. When he spoke again, his tone carried a noticeably different weight than it had at the beginning of the hearing. "Mr. Reeves," he said calmly, "the record now indicates that the amended agreement extended the delivery timeline, and that the final report Ms. Carter prepared was received within that revised schedule." Daniel Reeves straightened slightly, though the confident rhythm of his earlier presentation had faded. He glanced once more at the documents in his binder before responding. "Your Honor, the plaintiff's concern is that the report did not address certain financial projections associated with the redevelopment proposal." Judge Whitman shifted his gaze toward Emily Carter once again. "Ms. Carter." Emily stepped forward with the same quiet composure she had maintained throughout the hearing. She turned one page in her notebook and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, the financial projections referenced by the plaintiff were removed from the consulting scope during the amendment discussion." She paused briefly before continuing. "The amendment transferred responsibility for those projections to the project's independent accounting consultant." A few heads in the gallery turned toward one another, the audience now fully aware that the case they expected to watch conclude quickly had become a careful examination of details many had overlooked. Emily reached into her folder and produced another printed page. This memorandum was signed the same day as the amendment and confirms the reassignment of that responsibility. The clerk accepted the document and delivered it to the bench. Judge Whitman read the memorandum slowly, his expression thoughtful. The line Emily had mentioned was clearly visible, confirming that the financial projections were no longer part of her consulting duties. The judge looked up again. "Mr. Reeves, were you aware of this memorandum?" Reeves hesitated before answering. "Your Honor, I do not believe it was included in the original summary presented to the plaintiff." The judge nodded slightly but said nothing for a moment. The room remained silent except for the steady typing of the court reporter. Finally, Judge Whitman leaned forward and folded his hands together. His eyes rested on Emily Carter with a new level of attention. The woman standing before the court had arrived alone with a notebook and a quiet voice. Yet over the course of the hearing, she had carefully referenced amendments, timelines, correspondence, and procedural details with a level of precision that many trained attorneys struggled to maintain under pressure. In the gallery, the spectators watched closely, the earlier expressions of doubt replaced by a quiet respect. At the plaintiff's table, Daniel Reeves slowly adjusted the papers in front of him, aware now that every assumption he had entered the courtroom with was being examined piece by piece. Judge Whitman finally spoke again, his voice measured and deliberate. "Ms. Carter, based on the documents you have presented, it appears that several key elements of the plaintiff's claim rely on obligations that were modified or reassigned during the amendment process." Emily nodded once. She did not smile or celebrate the moment. She simply stood calmly beside the podium as the courtroom waited for what the judge would say next, the balance of the case now resting on details that only one person in the room had clearly understood from the very beginning. The courtroom remained suspended in quiet anticipation after Judge Harold Whitman finished reviewing the final memorandum. The kind of silence that spreads when everyone realizes the outcome of a case is beginning to shift in ways no one had predicted earlier that morning. The judge slowly closed the folder of documents and rested both hands on the bench, his eyes moving across the room before settling once again on Emily Carter. When she first stepped forward nearly an hour earlier, many in the gallery had assumed the hearing would end quickly, yet the woman now standing calmly beside the podium had methodically addressed each claim with documents, dates, and precise references that reshaped the entire discussion. Judge Whitman cleared his throat slightly before speaking. "Mr. Reeves," he said, his tone measured but firm, "the court has now reviewed the amendment, the revised delivery schedule, the confirmation of the final report submission, and the memorandum transferring responsibility for the financial projections. Each of these documents appears to alter the obligations your client claims were not fulfilled." Daniel Reeves stood very still beside the plaintiff's table, the earlier certainty in his expression replaced with careful restraint. He opened his binder again, scanning several pages before responding. "Your Honor, The plaintiff still believes the consulting services provided by Ms. Carter did not meet the expectations outlined when the original agreement was first drafted. The judge nodded slightly, but did not immediately respond. Instead, he looked toward Emily again. Ms. Carter, do you wish to address that statement? Emily stepped forward once more, her movements calm and deliberate. She glanced briefly at the page in her notebook before speaking. Yes, Your Honor, she said quietly. The expectations referenced by the plaintiff were discussed before the amendment was signed. After the redevelopment proposal expanded, the scope of my consulting work changed significantly. She paused briefly before continuing. That change is the reason the amendment was drafted and signed by both parties. The courtroom remained completely silent as she spoke. Emily reached into her folder again and placed another document on the podium. This document is the project revision summary prepared during the planning meeting on March 14th. It outlines the expanded environmental review and confirms that the consulting work would focus on regulatory compliance rather than financial modeling. The clerk delivered the page to the bench. Judge Whitman reviewed the document slowly, his expression thoughtful. The meeting summary clearly listed the participants present during the discussion, including the plaintiff and the project coordinator. The line Emily had referenced was highlighted near the center of the page. The judge lifted his eyes again and turned slightly toward the plaintiff seated beside Reeves. According to this summary, he said calmly, the scope of Ms. Carter's consulting work was formally revised before the amendment was signed. Reeves remained silent for a moment, then spoke carefully. Your Honor, it appears that the documentation Ms. Carter has presented reflects several discussions that were not fully reflected in the materials originally provided to my office. Another quiet murmur moved through the gallery. Judge Whitman leaned back slightly in his chair and folded his hands together once more. For the second time that morning, he studied Emily Carter with an expression that was no longer dismissive. The quiet woman who had entered the courtroom without legal counsel had now guided the hearing through a detailed reconstruction of the agreement itself. Every document she presented aligned with the timeline she described. Every reference she made matched the official filings already on record. The room understood it now. The case that once seemed simple had been built on an incomplete understanding of the very contract it depended on. And standing calmly beside the podium, Emily Carter waited patiently as the court prepared to decide what those details meant for the future of the case. The courtroom remained wrapped in quiet concentration as Judge Harold Whitman slowly placed the final document back onto the bench, his eyes lingering on the pages Emily Carter had methodically introduced over the past hour. The polished room that had once carried faint whispers of amusement now felt different, heavier with the realization that the case had unfolded in a way almost no one had expected when the hearing first began. Judge Whitman rested his hands together and looked across the courtroom before speaking again. Mr. Reeves, he said calmly, the documentation presented today indicates that the obligations originally cited in the plaintiff's claim were modified through a formally executed amendment, followed by additional project revisions and correspondence that clarified the scope of Ms. Carter's responsibilities. Daniel Reeves remained standing beside the plaintiff's table, his posture composed but noticeably more restrained than before. He glanced once more at the collection of papers inside his binder before addressing the bench. Your Honor, the plaintiff acknowledges that the amendment and related correspondence have clarified several aspects of the consulting arrangement. His voice carried less certainty than earlier in the morning. However, the plaintiff still believes there were misunderstandings regarding the expectations for the redevelopment analysis. Judge Whitman nodded slowly. Misunderstandings can occur in complex projects, he said, but the court must evaluate the legal obligations defined within the contract itself. He then turned toward Emily Carter once again. Ms. Carter, is there anything further you wish to add before the court reviews its findings? Emily stepped forward with the same steady composure she had maintained throughout the hearing. She did not rush to speak, allowing a brief moment of silence to pass before answering. Only one clarification, Your Honor, she said quietly. She opened her notebook to the final page she had marked earlier that morning. The redevelopment project referenced in this case later proceeded under the regulatory compliance framework outlined in my final report. That framework was approved by the City Planning Department 2 weeks after submission. A faint stir moved through the gallery as several spectators exchanged surprised glances. Emily continued calmly. The approval notice was issued on July 11th and confirms that the recommendations within the report met all environmental and zoning requirements for the site. She gently placed the last document on the podium. The clerk delivered it to the bench, and Judge Whitman examined the page carefully. The official letterhead from the city planning office was clearly visible, along with the approval signature at the bottom of the document. The judge leaned back slightly in his chair as he finished reading. For several seconds, he said nothing, allowing the quiet weight of the information to settle across the room. Daniel Reeves looked toward the plaintiff briefly, then back toward the bench. The confident narrative he had presented at the start of the hearing had slowly unraveled as each document revealed a more complete version of the agreement. Judge Whitman finally lifted his gaze again, his expression thoughtful rather than critical. The woman who had entered the courtroom earlier that morning with nothing more than a notebook and a folder of documents had reconstructed the entire sequence of events with careful precision. Every amendment, every timeline adjustment, every communication between the parties now formed a clear picture that had not existed at the beginning of the hearing. In the gallery, the spectators watched quietly as the judge closed the case folder once more, aware that the direction of the decision was becoming increasingly clear. And standing calmly beside the podium, Emily Carter remained composed, waiting with quiet patience as the court prepared to bring the long morning of arguments toward its final conclusion. The courtroom remained completely still as Judge Harold Whitman closed the final document and rested both hands on the bench, the quiet weight of the moment settling over every person in the room. The morning light still streamed through the tall courthouse windows, but the atmosphere had changed entirely from when the hearing first began. What had once seemed like a routine case had unfolded into something far more deliberate, shaped by careful details that could no longer be ignored. Judge Whitman looked down briefly at the stack of documents before lifting his gaze toward the courtroom. When he spoke, his voice carried the calm authority that only came after a careful review of every fact presented. After reviewing the amendment to the agreement, the revised project scope, the documented delivery timeline, and the city planning approval associated with the final report, he said slowly, the court finds that the obligations originally cited in the plaintiff's claim were formally modified through the executed amendment and subsequent project revisions. A faint stir moved through the gallery as the meaning of his words settled in. Daniel Reeves remained standing beside the plaintiff's table, his earlier confidence replaced with the quiet professionalism of someone who understood the direction the case had taken. The judge continued. The documentation presented today establishes that Ms. Carter delivered the consulting report within the revised schedule agreed upon by both parties, and that the scope of her work was adjusted in writing before the project proceeded. Judge Whitman paused for a moment, glancing down once more at the final approval letter from the city planning office. The court therefore finds that the plaintiff's claim relies on obligations that were altered prior to the alleged breach. The silence that followed seemed to stretch across the entire room. Several spectators in the gallery exchanged quiet glances, aware that they had just witnessed a hearing unfold in a way none of them had expected earlier that morning. Judge Whitman finally leaned back slightly in his chair and delivered the final words of the ruling. Based on the documentation and the timeline presented, the court dismisses the claim against Ms. Carter. The quiet murmur that followed was not loud, but it carried a clear shift in the room's energy. At the plaintiff's table, Daniel Reeves closed his binder with measured calm, offering a brief nod toward the bench before gathering his papers. Judge Whitman then turned his attention toward Emily Carter. For a brief moment, he studied the woman who had stood alone before the court that morning with nothing more than a notebook and a folder of documents. Ms. Carter, he said, his tone noticeably more respectful than when the hearing had begun. The court appreciates the clarity with which you presented the contractual record. Emily nodded politely, her expression calm and composed. She did not celebrate or draw attention to the moment. Instead, she quietly closed her notebook and gathered the documents she had organized so carefully. In the gallery, several spectators continued watching her with quiet curiosity. Only hours earlier, many of them had assumed the woman standing alone in a gray cardigan would struggle to defend herself in a courtroom filled with legal professionals. Instead, they had watched her reconstruct the entire history of the agreement with calm precision and steady confidence. As Emily Carter turned and walked toward the exit of the courtroom, the polished floor reflecting the afternoon light beneath her steps, the room remained silent once again. Not because anyone was waiting for the next argument, but because the lesson of the morning had already been delivered. In a place built on authority and procedure, the outcome had not been determined by appearance or assumption, but by patience, preparation, and a clear understanding of the truth written in the record.